The worst pandemic in the history of medieval Europe, the Black Death. Would you have survived it? The Black Death was one of the worst pandemics in human history, moving across continents and killing everyone in its wake. No one was immune, neither kings nor beggars. In the beginning, people thought the various instances of the plague were isolated events. Today, we better understand how to deal with a pandemic, even if we still cannot manage it in an ideal fashion. If people can resort to superstition and spiritual explanations for diseases and catastrophes today, it is not difficult to see why people in medieval times may have taken it lightly. On the other hand, the idea that the medieval era was filled with heaps of dung and barbaric marauders is also slightly exaggerated. That is not to say that those things were not true, but they paint a stark picture of the epoch. If one looks at the technological achievements of the Middle Ages, one realizes that it was more progressive than its reputation. If you lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, you would have most likely been a commoner with few opportunities to ascend the social ladder and engage in scholarly activities. Superstition would have loomed large. The few who championed reason would probably have been shunned by you and your peers. If someone suggested that fleas might be causing the spread of the plague, you would have given them the side eye and ignored them. But it is true. Now, historians know that fleas were the main cause of the propagation of the disease, even if debates persist over which animal was the primary carrier of fleas. Different forms of the plague have arrived repeatedly over the years. The first occurrence was in the form of the Justinian plague that occurred between 541 and 549. The mysterious ailment caused loss of life in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. The next major iteration, the one under discussion here, arrived in the 14th century and presumably killed 1/3 of the European population. This figure is an estimate, and many scholars have disagreed with it, so take it with a grain of salt. Generous estimates say that the European population may have been reduced by half. Plagues returned on multiple occasions, but never exerted the same numbers of death. It is important to understand that the plague was not just a single disease. It consisted of a collection of diseases, all of which were caused by the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis. Of course, the most famous of these diseases is the bubonic plague, which attacks the lymph nodes and infects vital organs. The second one is septicemic plague, that infects the blood and spreads rapidly. Finally, we have pneumonic plague, that is airborne and attacks the lungs, unlike the previous two. These diseases are still around, but the progress of science and technology has waned their impact to a considerable degree. However, back then, no one knew how to craft vaccines. Even the idea of quarantine arrived far too late. Going back to the question at the heart of the issue, what would life have looked like if you lived during these tough times? After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire had become increasingly Christian, and pagan influences had been drastically reduced. The Catholic Church was a dominant force, and in countries like England and France, it settled into a cozy position of power and authority. Since the Catholic Church was considered to be in the upper echelon of society, even though its influence extended to the bottom, the clergy was educated. The nobility and landowners had their fair share of influence, but the Church had more control than any other group, and the inherently abstract nature of the religious narrative allowed them to get away with anything. For instance, when the plague started ravaging major cities of Europe, the Church blamed the sins of people, claiming it was the manifestation of God's wrath. Since most of the population was Christian, the people accepted the rhetoric. At the time, the average person in Europe inherited a guilt of sorts, one that made them sink into depths of despair. The physical destruction was already wreaking havoc, and the mental warfare further worsened the situation. People started to resort to desperate measures, both in their personal and professional lives. While some imploded from fear of a vengeful God, others exploded, carrying a sour outlook on life. As such, personal and social aspects of life experienced major shifts. For instance, people started flagellating as a way to atone for their sins. Flagellation became a social phenomenon that would take place in public squares. But these people were considered fanatics by the Church. According to Catholics, the flagellants had taken things too far. The practice still becomes popular because it provided a solution, albeit an unsuccessful one. In desperate times, people resort to desperate means, and this was one of the most accessible choices. People even took it upon themselves to whip themselves in isolation. By beating themselves senseless, they externalized the guilt of their sins. It was supposedly meant to turn God in their favor. The plague also brought the anti-Semitic urges of Europeans to the forefront. The radical sections of society came together and started blaming Jews for the catastrophe. They would elicit forced confessions from scapegoats and decree whatever punishment they deemed suitable. It is believed that the movement to blame Jews began in Spain and southern France. It is quite unnerving to think that you would have an entirely different religious and political outlook on life if you were born in a certain time and under certain circumstances. Cities started to fall. The streets began filling up with bodies. Ditches were dug to get rid of the bodies. If you were going to buy bread, you saw corpses in the street contorted against each other. How would you react? It is hard to put oneself in the shoes of someone from that era. Still, it's possible to imagine just how egregious and mentally taxing the entire matter would have been. Who would not want to escape that hellhole? But where could one go? The plague was everywhere, and death was always lurking around the corner. For the wealthy and the elite, this did not matter. They had enough money and resources to travel to faraway places. They believed that if they could go to a solitary place, they could escape the scary death that the plague brought. They had the right idea, as we now know about the effectiveness of quarantine. Unfortunately for the elite during the Black Plague, in most cases, they contracted the disease in the city or on the way out of it. By the time they reached these remote towns and villages, they would have had the disease and spread it among the members of the troop and even spread it in the villages. Still, there were instances where some rich people avoided the disease by locking themselves away from the general population. People noticed this practice and wanted to test it for themselves. Over time, people started to exercise quarantines, and cities would specify a specific place for ill people. Once quarantines became popular, the spread of the disease lessened to quite an extent. The remedies of the Catholic Church did not help anyone. Living in the Middle Ages, you would be incredibly suspicious of the Abrahamic God. After all, it was a fairly simple quarantine method that helped alleviate the blunt pace of the pestilence, not God. Life before the Black Death was quite agrarian. Feudalism was common in Europe since the rich landowners controlled the land, and there was a very distinct sense of hierarchy in financial terms. This sense of submission, for lack of a better word, existed in religious realms as well. However, unlike their feudal overlords, people used to look up to the church, and the church was nowhere to be found. The clergy had fled the cities to find respite for their souls. The people did not have anyone to listen to their woes. The Black Death dramatically changed the religious standing of European society. The church lost its prestige and was undermined at every turn, eventually leading to Martin Luther's Reformation a couple of centuries later. So, would you have survived the Black Death in these erratic circumstances? The answer is multifaceted and depends on various things. For instance, if you were a Jew in Spain, you had a much better chance of survival. You would have lived in smaller, isolated communities. You would have practiced better sanitation that other people in Europe did not, such as washing your hands. However, you would have been persecuted for being the cause of the plague. It is thought that thousands of Jews died during this time due to massacres and other forms of persecution. On the other hand, if you were a Christian, you would probably lose your faith in the Catholic Church. Under these circumstances, if you chose to follow the Church to the ends of the earth, your chances would have been pretty low. On the other hand, if you thought and acted like a purely practical individual, you would have a fairly good chance of survival. At the end of the day, it comes down to immunity for the average person. How healthy were you? Was your body equipped to deal with the disease? At the time, people noticed that once you had been through a bout with the Black Death, it would generally not bother you anymore. So, if you had access to medical resources and managed to fend the disease off, you would probably be fine for the rest of your life. Then, others resorted to niche methods. Flagellation was one of these methods, but there were plenty more as well. The Black Death was a catastrophe unlike any other. In the mid-15th century, it destroyed everyone and everything in its path. The pestilence killed people left and right, but it did not spare animals either. The plague resulted in an overwhelming loss of animal life. It created a crisis of food and clothing that further worsened the conditions. Livestock was vulnerable to the plague, and the death of animals contributed to a rise in the rodent population. Rodents preyed on animals and carried the bacteria back and forth between different cities. The loss of human life also resulted in a labor shortage across Europe. This shortage would continue to affect Europe for several centuries afterward. On the other hand, the plague had given people something to occupy their time. Therefore, wars between European powers came to a screeching halt for a short while. The aftermath of the Black Death was negative for the survivors, but there was a silver lining. Their immune systems had evolved as a consequence, serving them well against illnesses in the future. The most telling impact of this phenomenon can be seen by comparing the lifespans of Europeans before and after the plague. With nearly half of its population dead, survivors had more resources available to them, leading to improved diet, especially among the poorer folks. Another great thing that happened due to the disease was that labor shortage prompted an increase in workers' rights. The consequences of the Black Death were far-reaching. As for who would have survived it, who knows? To learn more about the Black Death, check out our book, The Black Death, a captivating guide to the deadliest pandemic in medieval Europe and human history. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while they're still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.